Hello, movie lovers. Welcome home. My name is Amy Henserling, and you are listening to Watch This List. This is my 6th episode of Amy's Progress, wherein I am chatting with my closest friends on Letterboxd, who I feel can help me along in my journey to become a better person, a wiser person, hopefully, with their help and the help of these interesting films. Because it is October and horror month, I wanted to do a film that has religious overtones as well as existential ones, that talks about the nature of faith but also evil, particularly in this episode. My dear friend Ethan Lyon and I were originally going to do The Addiction, directed by Ferrera. And then I think somewhere down the line we felt that Exorcist 3, which is what we're going to be doing today, was more the answer. Ethan, I don't know if you recall what made us change, but that definitely did happen.
We definitely had a conversation at some point, and I can't even remember how it came up, but I think that we both agreed that we'd both seen it and we both found it terrifying. And I think I probably said to you a phrase which I think is actually quite relevant for our discussion, which is that if the original Atheist was directed by an atheist, so if the original Exorcist was directed by an atheist, then, and so it's an atheist's idea of a horror film, then The Exorcist 3 is a believer's conception of a horror film. And I think from that point onwards, it was pretty much cast as a die, because it was that interesting idea of faith, but also faith in a horror film, but also sort of the huge legacy that surrounds The Exorcist, this being obviously its 50th anniversary, the original film, and Blatty's sort of contribution to the franchise as its main shaper, both through writing the book, but also giving us Legion, its follow-up, and this film, which he directed himself.
Right. So it's more that it was just like, I think The Addiction is one that we both really like, but it wasn't necessarily one that is frightening, whereas Exorcist 3 has a little bit more of that horror element too.
It's also one I've actually never seen, The Addiction, and there was a little bit of me which was concerned that I
That's
would,
right.
Which was, there's always a thing, and I think this is the case whenever one gets close to a big film, which is the Addiction is not a big film per se, but it's loved by a great number of people. There's always the anxiety that you're going to dislike it in some way, shape, or form, which is fine if you're simply talking about it in a practical sense, either on Letterboxd or with friends. But going onto a podcast and talking about it and attempting to justify it in a effusive manner becomes significantly harder. And so I'd prepared materials for it, but I was, to be honest, quite anxious about it. And then you mentioned how much you liked Exorcist 3, and I'd seen it back in 2019 and was terrified by it, and I went, that's the one. It was just sort of, it was perfect providence in that respect. And so, yeah.
And we are also recording on Friday the 13th right now as well. Just to kind of optimize completely the symbolism here of the timing.
We're really going out for it. Also, apologies, dear listener, if I keep cutting over Amy. This is often how we talk, is not over each other, but very much
over each other.
Yeah, kind of to the point where sometimes we all say the same thing to each other. So beware for that more than once. And it's suitably atmospheric here in Yardley Hastings, the village that I am currently habiting in. It's raining buckets outside, and I live very near a church as well. So I went on a quick walk to the church before I came back for the podcast. So there is, so there was that as well to get us in the mood.
And before we actually started recording, Ethan's computer inexplicably just turned off, even though it was plugged in and fully charged. It literally just shut down randomly. So we're fine. Everything's fine here.
It's all right.
And
it's all right.
I
feel like
the end of the world is not near.
I feel like Blatty would approve of that. Of the eerie circumstances. And I mean, obviously the original Exorcist is littered with stories of things going wrong in various formats. So this is we're keeping in the spirit of things, certainly.
Right. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna dive in, and Ethan has done a lot of reading and thought on prepping this in terms of where Exorcist 3 falls in the franchise. It's an oddball one in the sense that typically I don't think, I know movies are, horror films especially, are usually in a franchise where there's like a million of them, right? But I am unaccustomed to watching third installments of things just in general. And for this to have been so good and so hard hitting that's unusual, especially since it's following one that was reviled and it still is considered to be crap. So Ethan, give us some context, both of where this is in the franchise, but then also what the movie's about, where it picks up.
Okay, well, we'll start with the plot because that helps in terms of detailing where it lies in the franchise.
Placing it.
Yes, very much placing it. Should also say that exploring The Exorcist and its background is something which came more naturally to me due to my theological background, or rather lack of. There are certain things that I think we, through our sort of various knowledge circles, cling on to, and mine is production history, textual understanding, and that was really my guide for my investigation of the Exorcist series. But the basic plot, it's Georgetown, late 80s. It's about 15 years after the events of The Exorcist, which ends with, obviously, Father Karras throwing himself down the steps, but vanquishing the demon that has possessed Reagan McNeil. 15 years later, Lieutenant Kinderman, who was a bystander in the original case, is investigating the reappearance of what is called the Gemini Killer, who was a religiously orientated serial killer from 10 years prior, who he eventually traces to the local psychiatric hospital. I believe it's Georgetown County Hospital. Someone can correct me on that. Where he meets a variety of unusual characters, including a ward of people with Alzheimer's, catatonia, and autism, interestingly, and a man in a cell further back into the hospital who has
cell 11,
who has Karras's body, but claims to be the Gemini Killer. And the film is about, the film functions firstly as a locked room murder mystery, namely attempting to understand a almost impossible setup for two savage murders, which are done with blasphemous intent. And the blasphemy is very important in this case. And then it turns into a wider meditation on the presence of evil within humanity, and and as a tangible construct, that in the theatrical cut ends with a exorcism performed by Father Morning on the Karras Gemini Killer hybrid, and in the Legion cut, or rather the director's cut, to be more precise, ends with Kinderman simply blowing the Gemini Killer's head off in his cell.
Right, with no exorcism prior.
With no exorcism at all. In fact, the character of Morning does not appear at all. There's a good reason for that, which was that...
The priest.
Indeed, yes. The priest, who never interacts with Kinderman, who pretty much never interacts with any other character. He appears in 3 scenes, and the last one is the exorcism. And there's a good reason for this, which is that Morgan Creek, who put up the money for the project, saw Blatty's cut, because Blatty wrote and directed this off of his own book, Legion, and said, well, where's the exorcism? We can't sell this as an exorcist film if you don't have an exorcism. And there was a long fight, and basically Blatty...
Typical studio.
Yeah. Well, it's even funnier because it went really badly. So they Blatty relented eventually, made the exorcism, put it all out there, and Blatty had gone, well, I don't want to call this Exorcist, I want to call this Legion, because if you call this Exorcist 3, people are going to think about the second Exorcist, and the second Exorcist was hated. Put bluntly, it's an incredible mess of a film, a very interesting film, but a complete mess. And ironically, apparently he heard back from the executives a few weeks later, and they basically went, yeah, we think it's because we called it's called Exorcist 3, that's why it's tanking. And Blatty just went, oh, for goodness sake. So nobody knew what was...
Because he had wanted not to call it that.
He wanted to call
himself.
it Legion, which is the name of the book,
right.
which in itself is taken from a passage from... Is it the book of James? We are...
No. Well, this is in the Gospel. Luke.
The Gospel.
Luke 8.
Yeah, thank you. I know very little of this, so thank you.
No, that's okay.
But
Luke 8, yes.
But Scott does, in fact, read a brief line from it, which gives the title, We Are Legion, about an hour into the film. Exorcist 3 is a fascinating film in a number of ways, mostly because it's a explicitly Catholic author who Blatty was a Roman Catholic all his life, was raised that way, went to Catholic schools, I believe wanted to be a priest at one point. He wanted to join the seminary. Creating a film where the concept of evil is not an abstract, but it is a real, tangible existence, where the devil can commit the most heinous of crimes and do the most blasphemous and atrocious of things with no remorse and no pity. And the only way to fight evil is through faith. And you can argue that all of the primary aim and interest of the Exorcist franchises, they're all about crises of faith and how you recover from them in various forms, whether it's Karras in the first film, whether it's Richard Burton's priest in the second film, Kinderman coming to terms with his own unbelief, as the Gemini Killer calls it at one point, or
yes,
Father Merrill in the Dominion and the Beginning prequels, and also in the Von Sydow films where he appears. So that, I think, was what really interested me about The Exorcist 3, and why I thought it'd be good for this podcast, because it's very much a film about having to come to terms with something bigger than ourselves, something uncontrollable and unmanageable, but also something that is solely bad, which I think is a very, very interesting subject, which I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts upon.
Well, and I was going to say, too, something that I wanted to posit to you as well, in addition to it being sort of faith-centric or lack of, Rob, like our Comics Rob, Watchmen Rob, has a stellar review of the first Exorcist. And something that he says really resonates with me. I wrote it down just so that I can actually reference it. But one of the things that he says is so powerful about the first film is that we as the audience realize through the duration of the film, the way that it unfolds, that as evil grows stronger and stronger, our despair grows deeper because none of our institutions are equipped to stop it. Like, money, influence, science, the cops, the church. Nothing is able to, and they keep bringing in different methods that just utterly fail. Even the exorcism itself, when they're saying the power of Christ compels you, she's still like levitating, and the only reason that she comes back down is because Satan decides to put her back down. It's not even because it's working. So it literally is like inexhaustible, the amount of resources they try to throw at just like simple, legitimate evil, like where it's just like, this is just pure evil, right? And then the only thing that can stop it, and this is how Rob phrases it, in the end, only the individual decision to recognize it for what it is and to be willing to sacrifice whatever it takes can defeat it. So that idea is very powerful, of like that in both instances of the first one and the third one, and I don't know if this is emblematic of the rest, an individual decision to eliminate the evil, either in this instance of him like literally putting a gun to the guy's head and pulling the trigger, or in the instance of the first one where Father Karras invites the demon in and then is killed. That's the only power that resolves the destruction. So that to me is a very, very powerful statement.
It's an individual act of faith, I think, is perhaps the most notable thing here. In terms of, it's an act of faith of so it's Karras believing that by bringing the devil into himself, he can avert the tragedy of Reagan. It's Kinderman having this belief that he might, the faith in the idea that he knows how to free his friend, because one of the key points of 3 is that he and Father Dwyer from the first film are both still very strongly affected by the death of Karras, both of whom they considered to be a very close friend. In Dominion, which is Schrader's prequel, he's making his appearance for the 3rd time on this podcast. It's about Lancaster Merrill.
We love Schrader over here, I guess.
I mean, Schrader is the patron saint of Catholic guilt in cinema, I think it's fair to say. So, certainly American cinema. Whether that's the same as with an Italian filmmaker, that's a very different matter. But certainly with American cinema, it's very much he is he's very good for that. And that film ends with Merrill exorcising a child and battling what becomes Pazuzu, which is the name of the demon in the second film, in a cave, and having to face his own anxieties and face his own despair. So I do think there's a lot about individual acts of faith from the person and not the institution, be it cops or science or anything of that description. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things, and probably one of the reasons why I think 1 and 3 work as strongly as they do, is because the inner torment of their main characters revolves around, how do I come to terms with faith? How do I come to terms with the evil I see around me? It's not that they don't believe. Certainly, I think the detective famously doesn't believe, but Karras believes, but his belief is faulty in as much as he's deeply affected by the death of his mother. And so I think it's very, very interesting in that way that Blatty really sort of centers that as a subject.
I also think it's very interesting. This struck me when I rewatched it this time in prep for this, that what leads George C. Scott, Kinderman's character, to act is that he believes in evil. Yes. So actually it's in a roundabout way that, like, he doesn't have the entry point of God. he has the entry point of like, and he has this long speech at the end where he's like, I believe in death, torture, hate, disease, pain, murder, cruelty, infidelity. He starts listing all these things. And basically it's like saying, you know, because I see the flip side of this, that's what's actually the catalyst for wanting or taking it very seriously, that a drastic measure is needed, because he essentially becomes a murderer. I mean, he is willing to kill very, very easily because of the strength of his clarity. And so that is also quite profound.
But notably, I'd also like to point out here that speech is not in the director's cut. That was entirely put in after the fact.
Right.
And that entire scene in the director's cut is effectively just him going to the Gemini killer and shooting, going, you're saved, you're free, Damien, or you're saved. It's either one of the two. And just shooting him. And it's as simple as that. And in some ways, it's the element of faith is modified there. You can perhaps argue that it's perhaps more about he believes in the faith of his gun to shoot a bullet into a man. But there's also something. Blatty later criticised the ending of the theatrical cut as being overly pyrotechnic. He thought it was looked good, but it didn't make sense with what came before in his head. And I think you can see him shooting the Gemini killer in the head as it is in the original cut, the director's cut, as almost a quieter act of faith. It's one which does not need to be outlined to the demon, outlined to the devil, who would wish to mock it, who would wish to turn it against him, who would, I suppose, challenge him on his pride by even saying it. It is just, no, you're gone, bye, shoots him twice in the head. And this is after Brad Dourif, who exclusively plays the Gemini killer in the original cut, has given these long, long monologues about the nature of killing and the pleasure he derives from it, and all this sort of stuff. And it's a fascinating element there, where it's just, at the end of the day, the words don't mean much. It's the action. In this case, it's pulling the trigger, which I find which is interesting considering the rest of the Exorcist films, where there's very much a sort of an act of, shall we say, Catholic faith, or Catholic ceremony being put in place. So a titular exorcism, there's one in the beginning, there's obviously the famous one at the end of Exorcist 1. There is the destruction of the Georgetown house at the end of Exorcist 2 in a completely bizarre scene involving locusts. And then there's arguably the two scenes at the end of the most recent Gordon Green one, Exorcist the Believer, which I saw yesterday as of recording, and in Dominion. So it's notable, I think, that Blatty chooses in his original cut to go for something much smaller and much more intimate than the aggressive imagery that is used in other films, even including his theatrical cut, where he's really laying it on quite thick.
I think there's a merit to both, quite frankly, because I think there's something very viscerally satisfying about him just walking in and shooting him dead. That to me is like, all right, the only way to get rid of you is to kill you. Goodbye. And that sort of like lays it. That's like you're saying, a lack of explanation. It doesn't need anything else. But I will say, what I do like very much about the inclusion of the priest who comes in and actually performs the exorcism in Exorcist 3 is when George C. is at home and that woman is there and she's about to choke him, and then she loosens her grip and stops because Brad's character can feel the priest just walking in and being nearby.
It's a wonderful
and then
shot
it flashes
as well.
back to Yes.
The door
It's a
slams
great
open.
moment of like when you have goodness come in, or when you have light or clarity, or just something that's here to save you, something that's here to help you, that the idea that evil stops, or that it's like, at least he has this line where he says, you've interrupted me. So evil gets interrupted. And I think that resonates viscerally. I think it's one reason why a lot of movies like the superhero stuff is so popular, in a sense, because it's at its very, very basic good versus evil level. And that's something that everyone sort of feels when the superheroes show up to defeat the enemy. There's this sense of relief and rightness. And so that captures that moment that otherwise wouldn't be there at all.
Let me put it to you, but there's a couple of things there. One, I think about the appeal of superhero films. But also I'd like to point out a little something about the end of... So in both films, for reference, in both films, there is a sequence where the Gemini killer possesses a specific catatonic woman, played by Vivica Lindfors, who dresses as a nurse and goes to Kinnaman's house with the aim of basically cutting the head off of Kinnaman's daughter, Julie. Both of them end.
Right.
Both of the scenes have a bit where this old woman, who is in her 70s or 80s at the point, and wraps her hands around Kinnaman's neck and is just about to strangle him. What is notable about the director's cut, though, is that the word Damien is heard. And that's what makes the woman stop. And that's when Kinnaman decides, I've got to shut this off at the source, basically, effectively pulling a computer out at the plug. And I think that's quite notable, is that I don't like superhero films, frankly. I think they're pompous, morally righteous, overly sentimental, overly serious schlock, bluntly. I find it very artificial and fake, and I don't see any of myself in it. But I do see myself in that little bit of just the voice yelling Damien, because that is what's left of Damien's humanity punching through what his body is being used for to contact his friend who he loves and who loves him. And that's incredibly moving to me.
You're talking about Father Karras.
Yes,
here.
Father Karras punching through the Gemini killer just for a brief second. And Kinnaman recognises it, and Kinnaman realises that his friend is still there, but the only thing he can do as a friend is to put him out of his misery. In an act of, I wouldn't say benediction, but certainly an act of great compassion, in a weird way. And these are films, I think, especially the first and third, where sacrifice and death can be conceived in compassionate terms, because what Karras does is effectively a mercy to Reagan, to this little girl, and he puts his life on the line, partly because he's finally found meaning, but partly because he realizes that there is something bigger than him and he must give himself to it. So I still think that the end of 3, the theatrical cut, looks amazing. I mean, it's got brilliant special effects shots. I mean, the stuff where the lightning shoots out the floor, or the snakes that appear, and there's all the fire. It looks great. I can't deny that. Doesn't quite hit me in the same way. But I wonder whether this is to do with my background, and whether this is to do with a cultural thing as much as anything else, in as much as that I often, if I have faith, I base my faith on what I believe to be the essential goodness of man, of the essential desire on one level to help one man to help another. And man here is a general term for human. the desire to connect, the desire to enliven the life of another. Now, certainly a lot of people don't do that, either because it's just not in their interests, or they've been pushed away from that, or for some misguided reason they think that is the way of doing things. But weirdly, it fits with my worldview, that ending of one man calling out to another, saying, "Help me, I am your brother," and the other one going, "I hear you, I will help you." So yeah, that's why that one really resonates. So I've gone rather deep there.
And
I do apologize.
No. I know. I think that's fantastic, and it actually illuminates it for me in a different way, because one reading is a human choice, and a largely, devoid of sort of a need for a spiritual understanding or a spiritual depth, because his character can do that whether or not God's involved. So you prefer the end that has nothing to do with God. Interestingly,
perhaps, yes.
Which, so you know what I mean? Like,
no, I
and
do.
maybe that's because you can relate. You can see how the humanity is like in the director's cut, in the Legion cut, the humanity is what stops the evil. In the theatrical cut, it is actually married to
yes,
a spiritual component occurring. So that actually does make sense, and it aligns with why that would speak to you more loudly or just thoroughly.
Yes.
And be more convincing.
No, I agree. But I think also that's one of the interesting things that's come from Amy's progress so far, is you've had episodes with Darren and you've had episodes with Hutch, episodes of which where it's been not two opposing schools of thought, but two schools of thought that are often in dialogue, discussing and attempting to come to something of an understanding or in a middle ground of faith and how it relates to their understanding of film. And that is a really interesting thing, I think, that you are doing in your own journey. I'm not sure whether you originally intended that to be part of your progress, shall we say. I've never read Bunyan, so I can't comment on whether that's part of, that you could infer that in the original text. But it's an interesting facet of what's coming through.
It's an attempt to have a sort of well-roundedness to that isn't just one viewpoint. I'm very interested in not only like in terms of film, like, okay, you and I can sit here and watch the same thing, and then what did you get? What did I get? How do our interpretations differ? There's that aspect which does interest me and always has, and that's always been present. But in terms of these types of films, and in terms of coming at them with the intention of, what is this saying about the nature of blank, evil, suffering, and then how is this film reconciling that? What is its solution? That is a more pragmatic desire that I have, where I'm like, okay, I see the problem, I recognize it, but how in this, with this, the guest that I'm talking to and this film, what do they think about what is the most effective way is in response to this issue? And so, yeah, I want to talk to people who are different than I am.
I'd like to,
in that regard.
Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to bring out here, and they're mostly to do with Blatty, and far be it from perhaps relating to, I know the dangers perhaps of bringing discussions of a text back to its author. That's quite an old school of thought. But I think it's quite relevant when it's a man who not only was explicitly a Roman Catholic, but was the writer and director of this film and the book it's based on. There's a lot of Blatty in this. Blatty once said that, and I think I quoted this at you when we were discussing this, Blatty once said that to him the presence of an exorcism and the presence of demons was, in his case, in his mindset, a good thing, because it proved that because there was an absolute evil, there must be an absolute good. And that's why his works are as aggressive and as violent as they are, because he felt that he needed to show the most intense, the most unpleasant manifestation of evil. Here it's the Gemini killer, as a way to, in his mind, effectively convince people that evil existed and it must be fought. And so there is, I think, in Blatty a certain pragmatism that he presents you with a very clear problem, a problem of evil. Basically, evil exists. What are you going to do about it? And then it's about his books are about, and the texts are about dealing with it, whether it's first eliminating the rational, as happens in both the original Exorcist and Exorcist 3, until the supernatural and faith are the only things that remain. So I think that's something very, very interesting as well when we're talking about sort of having discussions with other people about what are we getting from this, what's its pragmatic solution. And the pragmatic solution for Blatty is you've got to believe. And it's as simple as that. You have to believe, otherwise you're lost.
I'm going to go even a step further here and say, because this is, you're also, one way that I think that Exorcist 3 is incomplete and leaves us stranded as far as a solution's concerned, is that, how do I phrase this in the best way?
You'll find a way.
It's one thing to be able to see the evil outside of oneself, right? And to correctly name reality as it is. Like there's a line where I don't know how to refer to, I guess the Gemini killer, if you want to say, or if it's Legion, where his voice will change. There's a line that says, incidentally, I can help your unbelief. He is saying that you do have to be able to see how bad things are. But what this film is not getting at, and is my takeaway, and the profound thing that I'm going through currently, is that if you cannot also see that evil in yourself, you can't do anything about either. So that's why I told you, and when we were chatting about this, I said in relation to the 12 steps, this to me is the first one, because it is showing a sense of powerlessness in the face of pure destruction and just like annihilation and torture of these victims. Also the unmanageability of it, as in it can't be stopped. But then crucially, being able to connect that back to the self is the component that's missing, of course, because it's not the intention of the film. But I'm just saying, to me, what it comes down to is that if you cannot see your own darkness and face what's within you, that perhaps not on this scale could cause this stuff, but even in the smallest ways in your own life and my life, then that's the crucial thing, because that's the thing that we're blind to. It's much easier to say there's all these things externally. It's the same thing that happened in First Reformed. There's climate destruction, there's big corporations, there's institutional evil, there's structural sin, there's the church, there's evil cops, there's bad people. You can go on about that all day, but your own self-delusion is the key ultimately, and that's not something that this movie can reconcile with. But you have to kind of start, I think, with being able to see it even at all.
You could argue that, and I certainly think that's a very cogent way of understanding it. The one thing I would suggest is, I think, without wanting to flip back on my own argument, I think that Blatty would argue that the darkness within you is having no faith, or having your faith tested. And I do think that in Blatty's work, I think, from what I've seen of The Exorcist and what I've seen of Exorcist 3, I've not read the original of either. I ran out of time on my preparations. The act of not believing in itself, or the act of doubting belief, is what is a darkness, because it opens you up to potential possession or potential violence at the form of a demonic entity. It's what happens to Chris in the first. She's explicitly framed as an atheist, and Blatty went out of his way to make her a very normal individual, even though she's a movie actress, in a strange turn of events. And she has no faith, and so she has to witness the horror of watching her daughter be possessed and do these awful, awful things, blasphemous things. And I think you could perhaps suggest that for Blatty, the darkness comes from when we doubt God, or when we do not acknowledge God. It's a bit of a wonky theory, that, but something I do want to mention that came to mind when I was reading, there's a conversation at the end of the original book of Legion, and I need to get this quite right, because it's actually it's a very unusual ending. That basically, so I'm going to quote now from S.T. Joshi, who is a American writer on weird fiction, who wrote a piece on Blatty as part of a book he did on the subject. Spoiler alert, he really doesn't like Blatty. He's very, very against Blatty and Blatty's Catholicism and the intensity of the faith. But he quotes the end of Legion, which ends originally with Kinnaman giving a story where he believes that the Big Bang was caused by Lucifer, effectively, and that human evolution is rushing towards the reformation of Lucifer. And Blatty, and I quote, once said, "I had finally found the answer, a really satisfactory answer to the problem of evil." And I think that's quite interesting, that for Blatty, the idea of evil comes from the idea that we are all flawed, we are all dark, unless we believe in God, or a better world, shall we say, is what I interpret from these comments. Now, you can argue that Blatty's belief is quite severe and quite intense, and his mixture of science and religion to be a little unusual. He's very, very interested in the writings of a man called Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French Jesuit who influenced the character of Merrill in the original book and the film. But I think it's interesting how he identifies evil as a primary component of human existence, and that if there is no darkness explicitly rendered, it's because we all have it, and it's almost not worth elaborating on, that we are all fallen in his mind, which doesn't really leave much when it comes to thinking about redemption or improvement.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Yes.
Is that the movie, so instead of, one thing I like about horror films is they're somewhat comforting because they depict a spiritual reality, the idea of like that spiritual warfare is going on in a very obvious way. So it's like that we don't have to we can skip the step of convincing or having to be like, no, this is actually going on. And people are like, yeah, no, it's not. No. Here it is. It is going on. You can't say it's not. Okay. So now where do you start from? Like, I really appreciate that and resonate with like that we're starting from this proposed reality where people do not need to be convinced that things are going on that can't be explained or that supernatural events are occurring. So that's kind of nice that we're just like eliminating the denial aspect and like that we can't see the idea that we can't see what's going on.
And conversely, that's also why I find them so horrifying. Apologies for cutting you, but I just wanted to briefly mention that's why I find The Exorcist so terrifying, because it basically skips that middle step. But please continue. I apologize.
Skips that middle step. No, you're fine. And then also this idea of like that we are spirits. The Father Dreyer says this to George C. at the beginning, where he's like, well, we're spirits, because he's like, how do we reconcile the suffering? They're having lunch or whatever. And he says that. And then there's a great line that Legion, or the Gemini Killer, is spouting off, where he's saying, I wrote this down too. It's like, it's not enough, you see, to be a spirit. There's no magic. In this artificial box that you call a world, we can't not touch except through bodies. We must operate through neurological systems, brains that function. To me, coming back to alcohol and any sort of addiction, you are dealing with something that is bodily. You're dealing with something that's in your mind, that's going into you, right? Possessing you. Like I said to you earlier, I don't think it's a mistake that alcohols are called spirits, because it is something that animates, something that gets under your skin, literally. And so what Exorcist 3, to get back to what you just said, where it's like, it is eliminating the problem, but it is not providing a way out. It doesn't provide redemption. There's no healing other than just the end of suffering. So to me, it is that Karis is saved in the sense that his suffering is ended, but he's not restored. Or if you want to put it in the terms I'm becoming familiar with, he's not recovered. So then it comes down to, right, what is the reconciliation way? If we are faced with such insurmountable obstacles, great or small, just in our own world, what is the way to heal? And I think that he doesn't provide an answer, actually.
Spiritually, I don't think he does, and I think you're right, and I think that might well be an expression of his very deep pessimism about the human condition. But I also think as well, he's very... I also think... I think that interconnection of people, the capacity for people to connect and love one another, is perhaps not the solution, but reaching out to another person is perhaps a gesture towards healing. The thing which comes to mind is admitting that there's always a bit of a running gag, which is when you it's used outside of addiction, but it's a very, very important one, which is admitting. The first step is admitting you have a problem, and it's about reaching out and touching others. You can see that at the end of Exorcist, the original Exorcist, where Dwyer and Kinnaman become friends and they go to the cinema together to see Casablanca with Lucille Ball and Groucho Marx, if memory serves.
It's a Wonderful Life?
No, in the original, I checked.
Oh, you're talking about the first one.
In the original one, it's The Exorcist, it's Casablanca. But at the start of Exorcist 3, it's A Wonderful Life, which is...
It's a Wonderful Life.
Which, again, is a film about the supernatural connection, but also being tested in many respects. It's about being tested through various hardships, although in George Bailey's case, he arguably brings a lot of them on himself, unlike the outside forces of The Exorcist. But I think if Blatty offers any solution, or any sort of thing, it's about reaching out and touching others and being in contact. And that's why I think the ending of the director's cut, where he yells Damien, works, because that is an expression of faith. That's an expression of help. That's an expression of not being within this closed body of flesh, as the Zodiac Killer might consider it, where it's one spirit touching another. And I think that, even though it's perhaps a little bit of a circuitous argument on my part, which repeats itself far too much, I think that Blatty would consider that to be an important element, in the same way that you see it in, I think in Dominion as well, there's a lot about, even though Blatty didn't have anything to do with it, he liked it, and he thought it was a very classy film, in his own words, and I think he eventually saw it with Schrader. That's another film where it's about people coming together and to defeat evil, so to speak, and sort of a communion.
Well, I will say this too. I think that this is maybe my conclusion. If let's say this. So, do you feel like what you just said is that's like you would say that's your takeaway,
that's
right?
My
like
reading.
That's what that would be the positive that you come away with. Because I want to let you express yours, and then I'll tell you what I think it is.
I suppose that is the thing, and I suppose that's the thing that Blatty's interested in at the end, is that there's evil, and then there's the absolute good of God, but in between is us. And we really, it's the connections we make that are the most important thing in defeating evil. And evil lurks within doubt, and evil lurks within temptation of doubt. And that comes from being within. And we must learn to be without. So that's my takeaway of it. Whether I quite believe it as a philosophy of life, I don't know, but I do think the importance of connection between people is essential. But I'd be very interested to hear what you think.
Okay, so, and I think we'll end with this as I'm contemplating this, and then maybe give a couple of final thoughts. But this is really what I want to say, if I could sort of say anything in this. But this has been just an excellent discussion, Ethan. Thank you. That when there's the exorcism scene in Exorcist 3, when George C's character looks at the character of Brad Dourif, he sees Karras. He sees Father Karras, like the actor, literally. He sees his face. He talks about that. He makes this line about Jesus stilling the sea and calming the storm right before the exorcism actually takes place, and he's attempted to be cast out before he actually just kills the priest, and then he has to come in, and that's sort of the dramatic fashion, the sensationalism of the showman. The Hollywood
real
sort of thing that I understand.
Showmanship, as Dourif earlier says.
Right. Real good showmanship. Yeah. Sorry for the rant. But yes, that's the part where this kind of gets, okay. But there is, to me, it is not a mistake that he mentions that, because in Luke 8, where this passage comes from, the Legion passage, that's quoted in the film and is sort of its fulcrum. The passage before this is when Jesus stills the sea and calms the storm. Literally, it's Luke 8:22 until we get to the next part, which is the demon. I'm going to read this and I told Ethan I was going to do this. I'm going to read this in its entirety. It's only 13 verses. That is literally the entirety of the story of Jesus healing the man with this particular demon. And this, I believe, personally, has the problem and the solution packed. So this conclusion is my conclusion. Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so this is what it is. Just curl up by the fire, Ethan, and just relax while
I'll sit in the pew.
Yeah, there you go. I am a reader at church, so this feels quite at home. Okay. When Jesus, this is from Luke 8:27, starting with 27. When Jesus had stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time, he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house, but among the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. And they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now a large herd of pigs were feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and the country. Then people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. So, to me, the movie ending on him dying is like as though Jesus had met this man and just killed him to stop the suffering, and just been like, you know what? There's way too much wrong here. We can't reconcile it, but we can at least stop the suffering. But that is not what Jesus did, ever. He didn't conduct the ministry in that way. He healed the sick. And so to me, that is like the way to live would be how it's almost like merging what you were saying with that scripture, which is that we need each other in order to have like a reason for being, like a reason to be here. But then we also need this supernatural power to come in, and then we can go out and be like, this is how I've been healed. This is what I'm experiencing. This is literally happening to me, Amy. This is the good that I'm doing, and these are the answers that I'm finding, and I want to share them to anyone who's suffering, for whom it would be useful at all. And I think that's the service component. That's the component where we can actually enact change within each other that doesn't have perhaps anything to do with something else.
That is a lot. That is a lot to think about. And I can't say that I've absorbed it all in one listening, but I think it's going to inform a lot of me when I rewatch this eventually, because this is a film I rate very, very highly. So at the very least, you've given me very much food for thought. So thank you.
Yes, and I'm so appreciative. I was telling Ethan before this that I watched this crazy movie, The Rapture, last night, and part of the fear of doing anything that is married to a stance or a particular belief or what have you can be alienation and isolation of others who perhaps don't know or don't want to know or don't want to be familiar with it or have some sort of tie to it.
Or have preconceived notions.
And I certainly preconceived notions, but also could be trauma or pain or just like that, they were hurt by someone who professed similar things to what I'm saying and they don't want to have anything to do with it, which I completely respect. But I do want to just say, in as much as I feel that my heart is in the right place and that I hope that in the way that I am learning myself, that we can take film seriously in the way that it can teach us things, and that the combination of these things is my greatest passion, to merge what I see in movies with talking to you and talking to people who also love them, and that we could actually be more deeply affected than just watching something, that we could actually be moved.
I think you're
change.
Probably already doing that. I think the initial response to the series has pretty much confirmed that as an outsider who has watched the first few episodes. But it's always harder to consider that when you're right at the coalface of it. But I think I'm pretty sure I speak for pretty much the rest of the regular audience, are very much looking forward to seeing where this goes. And I'm very, very grateful that I was allowed to be a slightly eccentric part of it.
With that, thank you very much, Ethan. I hope that everybody watches this movie and gets as much out of it as Ethan and I have. And we'll see you at the movies.